It is the economy that Habitat for Humanity was built on, and it's called biblical economics. Now, I come from one tradition of worship. It is very important for you to understand that Habitat was founded by Christians, but people who work with folks of all faiths, both to build and to get houses, and those who claim no faith at all. Jonathan Redford says that Christianity is our center, it is not our boundary, and you will hear in a few moments how that works out. But in my faith tradition, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, there is this thing referred to as biblical economics. It's about a widow who has a prophet come to her door one day. And he says to her, I need you to fix me a meal. And she says, I don't have anything but a handful of flour and a few drops of oil, and I'm about to make a meal for my son and me. There's famine in the land, and we're just going to die. And the prophet says, no, ma'am, I need you to make a meal for me. And she hears what he says, and she makes the meal. And the scriptures tell us that as long as he stayed with her, the oil never ran out and the flour never ran out. The scriptures don't tell us how long he stayed. Did he stay 6 days or 6 months or 6 years? We don't know. What we know is that it was enough to last throughout the time because she was faithful. We know another story from the New Testament about a young man standing on a hillside in Israel. And before him are 5,000 people, and he's doing what I'm doing, yapping away. And they're listening, and they're there for a while. And they get hungry, and his disciples say to him, these folks need food. Send them away so they can get it. And he says, no, you feed them. And they have to look around the crowd, and they find a little boy with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, which he willingly surrenders. He doesn't reach up and say, wait a minute, I got to have one of those for my IRA. He hands it all over and says, take it, use it. And Jesus holds it up and he thanks God for it. And he takes it and he breaks it and he feeds 5,000 people. And the scriptures tell us, and I believe, that there was food left over. I've seen it in my life, so I can tell you. I haven't seen 5,000 people fed with a handful of fish and loaves. I've seen greater miracles than that. I've seen 4 million people get houses. 800,000 families get houses because of what we have done together. So I believe those words. I believe those miracles. Well, now I talk about human economics, and I want to tell you a couple of stories. I've been on the road since August 31st, and I've been hearing wonderful stories. Habitat still brings me around to tell the stories of beginning Habitat, but they don't need me anymore. There are wonderful families. We've now grown up a generation and a half in these Habitat houses in 37 years. And there are wonderful stories. Terry's is one. There are so many more of people who have grown up in those houses. I've had the privilege of hearing a lot of them the last few weeks. And 2 of the great ones are when I was in Yakima, Washington. And a young man named Luis Mondaga was brought to the stage. Now, Luis had been sitting at the table with me. He's 31 years old. And his mama was there sitting with us because I speak Spanish and so we could chat. And through the door kept coming the people for the crowd that were coming to hear us that night. And suddenly a man walked through the door, a man named John Van Bell, who used to be the executive director of that affiliate. He was the first ED there. Now this young man, Luis, has grown up in that house. It's 23 years since he moved in. He was 8 years old when he moved into that house. When John Van Bell walked through that door, it was not the 31-year-old man who stood up, it was the 8-year-old boy. And he shouted, Mama, look, it's John Van Bell. And he ran to him like that 8-year-old kid. And I don't apologize for my tears, folks. If you aren't moved by these stories, something's wrong with you. He ran to that man and threw his arms around him like that little 8-year-old boy. And one right after the other, they came through that door. You need to hear this because you are going to touch kids' lives as you go through these years. And you cannot imagine how profound that is. Don't forget those kids. Get to know those kids and encourage them. Anyway, Luis gathers all these people together, and then when he gets to the stage, he tells us about being 8 years old and moving into that house. The thing that moved the audience the most that night was when he talked about one of the board members inviting him and his family to come to their house. And he said, he told us to bring our swimming suits, so I guess that he lived near a lake or a river. And he said when we got to his house, There was a swimming pool. I'd never seen one. Imagine that. Imagine that he had never seen a swimming pool. The experiences, these families' experience as we get to know them and they get to know us, the experiences we have are magical. They are amazing. But Luis goes on a little further and he talks about what it was like to grow up in that house. And he says, you know, I'm here in Yakima, Washington, where you understand apples. You know, we've got a lot of apples around here that we're having for refreshments. A lot of those apples came from Yakima, Washington. And he said, my father picked apples in the fields. That was his job. We got our Habitat house, and he says, my father's illiterate to this day. He said, we moved into our house, and my father was so afraid that something might happen, that we would lose that house, that he went out and double and triple worked hours, different hours and shifts, in order to be able to pay off the house. And we paid our house off in 8 years. A 20-year mortgage, and the father paid it off in 8 years because he didn't want something to happen to him and that family lose that house. He said, along the way, my father worked up such a work record that suddenly he got invited to come into the factory, the canning factory, and work. And he said, I know you got your stories about the kids that graduate from Harvard. Aren't they wonderful? I know you got the stories about the kids who were the first generation to graduate from college. He said, I'm one of them. But for my father to go from the field to the factory was a leap across the world. Now he had a steady job. Now he had benefits. And he said he's there working right now. That's why he's not sitting here with us tonight. We have to see the wonderful success stories of these families and celebrate them. They don't all have to be the greatest. They just have to be that move forward that gave that family hope and made them do more than they had ever imagined that they can do. Well, while Luis was talking, they invited another family member up, a little boy named Damian Cavazos, and he's 8 years old, just like Luis was when he moved into his house. And they brought Damian up, and boy, he was listo. He was ready to talk. He got up there to the stage, and he sat down, and they handed him the microphone. They asked him his name and all the rest of it. They asked him what was great about his house, and he said, we all get our own rooms. And then they said, what else? And he said, when we gather as a family, we don't have to sit on one of the beds. We have a whole room called a living room to sit in and live together. So this is a little 8-year-old guy's perspective. And then they asked him, they said, Damian, what do you want to be when you grow up? And that little boy leaned into the microphone, he said, a paleontologist. And the audience responds just like you did. And then the MC said, well, wait a minute, Damian, let me ask these folks. How many of you out there don't know what a paleontologist does? And a lot of folks were honest and raised their hands. And they said, tell him, Damian. And he said, it's somebody who digs up dinosaur bones and studies them. I can't wait to hear Damian's story when he's grown. He's probably going to look at somebody and say, what do you mean a Habitat house? I grew up in a nice, decent house. The day, if we ever reach it, when we eliminate substandard housing from the face of the earth, will be without the logo. We'll be without all of those things because Habitat can't do it alone. And this thing we call the logo, I call it the idol, will not be the thing that does it. That day when children don't know they grew up in a special house, a different place. We work so hard to make sure our houses fit the neighborhood and look like other houses. I can't wait till Damian grows up and wonders, why is everybody making on so big about the house? It was a nice house, and that's what we want. We want him to have a nice house. And we call our houses trampolines, not safety nets. Kids' lives bounce off of that trampoline, and mothers' lives and fathers' lives, families' lives take off from those Habitat foundations. Well, the last story in that line was that in Delaware last week, I was on a site where we broke ground for a new home. And we were there so briefly, it was such a quick event that we hardly had time to get to know each other's names. But a young mother arrived with 2 little girls. One she was still carrying, maybe 2 years old, 3 possibly. The other little girl was about 5. And the little girls were kind of, shy and not getting very engaged, and all of us were playing around with them, trying to get them excited about this is where your new house is going to be. And they stood there through this few minutes of chat. The executive director began to explain to the mother, you're going to come in the driveway here, and you're going to enter the garage, and you're going to go into the kitchen, and he's giving her kind of the review we got yesterday when we closed our eyes and imagined our homes. And the little girl, the older little girl, was standing there. Her face was all crinkled up. She was trying hard. What is that man talking about? But you could see she was getting it. She was seeing it. And then pretty quickly it was over. They helped break the ground. The mother talked about a story not unlike yours. They live in a subsidized apartment in a place where they don't know who's at the door or what they want. And she said, so I just want a home where I can raise my girls in safety. That's her dream. The little ceremony ended and we walked to the back of the lot. The little girl, the little tiny one, was jumping off of a log and just enjoying herself, and she looked over at me and started jumping up and down, so I jumped up and down with her a little bit. And the adults are talking about what's going to happen and what's going to be cleared and how and where. And all of a sudden, the older little girl put her hands in the air, and she began to move. She started singing. And I shushed everybody and said, let's hear what she's singing. That little girl, I'm gonna get a doggy. We make mama's dreams about safe places to raise their children come true, and we make little girls' dreams about I'm gonna get a doggy come true. That's what you're gonna be a part of. It's as simple as that and as deeply profound as that. That's who we are and what we do.